Today I will be talking to you about one of the most unique habitats on Earth, one that is home to a plethora of carnivorous plants. Peat bogs. Peat bogs are a type of wetland formed by a species of moss called sphagnum. Sphagnum moss functions similarly to coral in a coral reef, continuously growing and covering the landscape, creating an ecosystem where the ground itself is alive, and providing critical habitat for a plethora of unique species. Sphagnum moss can grow in any place that is continuously wet, like a lakeshore, for example. It grows in mounds, expanding in all directions, and creating darkness in the interior of the mound. Any moss that does not receive light will die, so the mound is made largely of decomposing moss with a living layer on top that grows and dies and adds to the mass of the mound. Over time, the moss literally builds land, sometimes creating large hills over thousands of years, or sometimes even filling in entire lakes, or creating floating, growing islands that move with the water. These huge formations of moss are known as peat bogs. Sphagnum moss is rich in chemicals known as tannins. You may be familiar with these if you have a freshwater aquarium, where they leach from wood and stain the water brown. Tannins are found in almost all plants, although they are found in a particularly high concentration in sphagnum moss. They create acidic conditions and are the main reason why water often looks brown, as they are released when plant matter decomposes. All of that dead sphagnum moss decomposes into a unique soil called peat. In the process of decomposition, a huge amount of stored tannins are released, creating incredibly acidic soil. This, combined with the natural antifungal properties of sphagnum, means that the bacteria and fungi that normally cause decomposition cannot survive. Tannins aren't the only thing that's released by decomposition. Everything stored in plants, including nutrients, is also released when plant matter decays. But with no decomposition, the soil becomes entirely devoid of nutrients. The sphagnum moss continues to grow, as mosses are actually capable of extracting nutrients directly from the air. This is how moss can grow on trees, not by parasitically stealing nutrients from the tree, but by gathering them from the air. Another reason for the lack of nutrients is that sphagnum moss has specialized cells that suck up water and hold it there, then slowly release it to keep the moss wet long term. Sphagnum is incredibly good at absorbing water. It can actually hold more than 25 times its weight in water. Because of this, peat bogs actually have a dramatically raised water level compared to the surrounding area. This water, which often stays perfectly motionless buried deep within the moss, prevents the flow of oxygen farther than a few inches down into the soil. This creates anaerobic conditions, where whatever bacteria and fungi manage to grow in the soil, despite the acidity, lack of nutrients, and antifungal compounds produced by the moss, have no oxygen to breathe. Some species can tolerate this, but they grow very slowly. This lack of decomposition also means that despite what many people believe, peat bogs are some of the cleanest ecosystems on Earth. Sphagnum moss was actually used as bandages during World War II. It was very effective since it functions as a natural disinfectant. Sphagnum moss is far from the only thing that lives in the peat bogs. Many plants and animals have unique adaptations to survive this environment, and they must be specialized for it, so they cannot survive anywhere else. Among these are a large portion of the world's carnivorous plants, along with other strange and beautiful plants such as bog buttons, wild cranberries, reindeer moss, and even a plethora of orchids. One of the most important of these plants is also one of the most common, wiregrass. One of the most crucial aspects of a peat bog is fire. This sounds strange, but all plants native to peat bogs either have fire-resistant seeds that sprout after the fire burns out, or have thick underground roots or tubers that sprout new leaves and stay wet and cool buried in the sphagnum, which absorbs so much water that it's impossible to burn. The only plants that cannot survive fires are the fast-growing woody shrubs and trees which inevitably grow and use huge amounts of water. These shrubs can actually cause a peat bog to completely dry out if left unchecked, killing the native plants, including sphagnum moss, and allowing oxygen to reach into the soil. This invites decomposition, completely destroying the whole ecosystem. However, regular fires can burn and kill these woody shrubs and trees. Wiregrass, which grows across the bog and forms huge grassy fields, is responsible for carrying these fires across the bog, allowing them to spread and kill off shrubs. Without wiregrass, there would be nothing to burn and the fire would die out. Plants don't just store tannins and nutrients, they also store carbon dioxide. You've probably heard about how forests store CO2 and act as a carbon sink, helping to slow global warming. This is true, but trees aren't the best plants at doing this. Sphagnum is. Carbon dioxide, like stored nutrients, is released when plants decompose. However, peat bogs prevent this from happening, and since they're composed almost entirely of plant matter, they have a truly incredible amount of CO2 trapped in them. Despite covering only 3% of the world's surface, they contain 30% of carbon dioxide. When a bog dries out and decomposes, it has a serious impact on the world's climate. In 2016, Indonesian peat bogs, which have been mostly drained for agriculture, caught fire. Bogs need frequent burning, but the soil is usually wet enough that it doesn't burn, unless the bog is drained. The fire burned for months, and the smoke cloud was clearly visible from outer space. Peat bogs are frequently drained for agriculture or urban development, and the peat is mined out and sold for gardening, where it has many uses for improving soil quality. The sphagnum dies, and the other inhabitants quickly follow. The bog releases stored carbon dioxide slowly, becomes a massive fire hazard, and contributes hugely to global warming. 97% of peat bogs have suffered this fate, and as a result, most species of carnivorous plants, bog orchids, and more are extinct or endangered. If you see sphagnum moss or peat for sale, please try not to buy it and use whatever alternative materials that you can. Sphagnum moss from New Zealand is harvested sustainably, so despite the high price, if you must have sphagnum, get New Zealand sphagnum. There are many alternatives for peat in gardening. There are efforts from various organizations to preserve bog ecosystems, but they need help to do this. I'll have links to some of these organizations in the description. I encourage you to look at these websites and learn more about what they're trying to do and how you might be able to support them. That's all for this video. Sorry it had such a sad ending. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments and I'll try to answer as soon as possible. The next video will be about some of the most magnificent carnivorous plants in the world, found in the peat bogs of the North American East Coast. Sarracenia.